Have you ever wondered if you were born at the right time? You know, not in the sense of whether your birth was timed well with your parents' relationship or their age, but rather in terms of history. Were you lucky enough to be born in an era that didn't have some terrible, life-altering event happen around the time you entered the world? Some people are born into wars, plagues, famines, or other disasters. And while some of these situations are survivable, others can easily kill even healthy adults, let alone newborns. Sometimes being born is the only thing that can save you from death, like in the case of those who were born as slaves. And other times you would have been better off never being born at all. Today we're going to talk about both scenarios. Here are 5 times it would have been better for you to not be born. Number 5. During the Black Death. There's no doubt that being born during the COVID pandemic sucks. ULL grow up hearing stories of how terrible things were in 2020 and wondering what the fuss is all about. ULL also probably get a few extra questions from nosy relatives whenever someone asks you how old you are. But there are much worse diseases than COVID, the plague that ravaged Europe in the mid-1300s. Known as the Black Death, is thought to have killed between 75 and 200 million people, which was half to 2/3 of the entire population. This horrible outbreak of bubonic plague started in Asia and made its way along trade routes to Europe. It spread so quickly that there weren't enough cemeteries to bury the dead, and mass graves had to be dug instead. Historians believe that since the disease was spread by fleas living on rats, the more densely populated areas were hit the hardest. But that also means that it likely spared many rural communities. So if you happen to be born in a village in the countryside in 1348, you might have had a good shot at survival, especially if you were born after the plague hit. If your mother managed to survive giving birth to you, she could pass on antibodies that helped fight off the plague, meaning you would have immunity against the disease. Some researchers even suggest that this may have been one reason why the plague seemed to just as suddenly end as it began. However, there is some debate as to whether the survivors of the plague had any real immunity, or if they simply moved on to other things once the city they lived in wasn't filled with corpses anymore. Either way, you wouldn't want to be born too late, because if you were born after the plague hit and your mom didn't have immunity, then you would have gotten sick. And if you were born before the plague hit, well, there's a good chance that you would die from it. 4. Around the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. If you like Roman history and have watched Gladiator a few times, then you already know about the eruption of Mount Vesuvius and the destruction of Pompeii. But did you know that another nearby town called Herculaneum was actually hit harder by the eruption? Although Pompeii is the more famous of the two towns, modern studies show that Herculaneum was actually twice as densely populated. It's also believed that Herculaneum was wealthier than Pompeii and was likely home to many influential Romans. On August 24, 79 AD, an earthquake shook the area. Then the next day, Mount Vesuvius erupted and sent pyroclastic flows down its slopes. Pyroclastic flows are fast-moving currents of hot, gas and solid matter that race down mountainsides. They travel so fast that they can reach the bottom of a volcano before anything else does, like ash or falling rocks. Since Herculaneum was built at the base of Mount Vesuvius, it was hit first by these pyroclastic flows, which reached temperatures of 230 degrees Celsius and contained rocks that were as big as houses. These deadly flows completely obliterated Herculaneum and its 2,000 or so inhabitants. If you had been born a couple of months earlier or later, you might have lived to tell the tale. However, It's not certain that anyone could have survived outside of the immediate vicinity of Herculaneum, as the eruption sent a layer of ash over the entire Roman Empire. No, 3. In the middle of the transatlantic crossing. One of the worst things that can happen to a ship is to run into a hurricane. Hurricanes are massive rotating storms with sustained wind speeds of at least 74 miles per hour. They usually form over warm ocean water and can cause catastrophic damage in the areas that they hit. When ships ran into them, the seas became rough and the winds threatened to tear the sails from their masts. But there was one place where sailors had to cross the ocean that was particularly prone to hurricanes, the North Atlantic. To avoid the harshest weather, most ships would wait for calmer weather and a favorable wind before crossing the Atlantic Ocean from Europe to the Americas. This meant that they would often leave in the spring or summer and take anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks to reach their destination. However, sometimes the ships had to make the journey much faster. Between 1900 and 1930, over 600 ships sank in the North Atlantic, most of them due to bad weather. That is, because shipping companies started competing with each other to see who could make the trip across the Atlantic the fastest. They also started building larger ships that were difficult to maneuver and unstable in rough waters. So if you were born on a ship that was making the crossing in the early 1900s, you would have likely died within a few hours of being born, too, during the Salem witch trials. If you've ever wanted to live in a world without lawyers, just look at how things went when the Salem witch trials took place in Massachusetts in the late 1600s. A group of young girls started having fits and screaming in the streets. And soon more and more girls started doing the same thing. The local minister, Reverend Samuel Parris, believed that the girls were being afflicted by witchcraft, and so did many others. Tituba, a slave, was one of the first people accused of practicing witchcraft. She was tortured in order to get her to confess, and she eventually did, naming 2 other women as co-conspirators. Soon, people were being accused left and right, and the court system descended into chaos. People were accused of being witches based on flimsy evidence, such as the testimony of young girls or the presence of small, dark-colored marks on their bodies. Over 200 people were accused of practicing witchcraft in Salem, and 19 of them were executed, either by hanging or pressing. Being born into this environment would have been pretty scary, as you might have ended up being accused of being a witch yourself. Thankfully, the trials ended in 1693 after the governor of Massachusetts intervened. But this dark period in American history would have been a very unfortunate time to be born, one in Nazi Germany. If you were born into the wrong family in Nazi Germany, your chances of survival weren't very good. You see, Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933 and quickly started enacting his plans to remove all Jews and other undesirables from German society. He created a system of laws that stripped Jewish people of their citizenship and banned them from working in certain professions. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws were passed, which defined who was considered Jewish. Under these laws, anyone who had 3 or more Jewish grandparents was considered Jewish, even if they didn't practice the religion. These laws also prohibited marriages between Jews and non-Jews, as well as sexual relations between the 2 groups. In 1938, Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, took place. During this event, Nazis and their sympathizers attacked Jewish businesses, homes and synagogues throughout Germany and Austria. Thousands of Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. And when World War II began in 1939, the persecution of Jews became even worse. Those who were able to escape Germany did so, often leaving behind everything they owned. And those who stayed behind were eventually sent to concentration camps, where most of them were killed. If you were born into a Jewish family in Germany during this time, you might have been taken away from your parents and sent to a camp where you would be experimented on by doctors or forced to work until you died. Even if you were born outside of Germany, being born in the midst of world, water meant that you would likely witness horrible things. You would probably be separated from your family and possibly live in fear of your parents' deaths or even your own. Click here to watch one of these next videos and let us know in the comments section which time period would have been the absolute worst for you to be born in.